One thing that always grabs my attention when it comes to games, aside from art style, game mechanics, or even genre, is a good soundtrack. Soundtracks in games give that helpful push that a player needs while playing the game to immerse themselves in the experience. From the more actiony battle themes that play when fighting enemies or bosses, to the more calm soundtracks that play in the downtime of a game. However, some games take the idea of music a step further, by combining the soundtrack with the mechanics of the game, making music a truly integral part of the experience. Rhythm games are nothing new, with one of the first rhythm games being released in 1989 with Human Entertainment's Dance Aerobics on the Nintendo Entertainment System. The genre was popularized greatly in 1997 with Parappa the Rapper on the PlayStation 1. Rhythm games would go on to span numerous popular titles the world over. Games like Dance Dance Revolution dominated arcades, while Guitar Hero / Rock Band and Rhythm Heaven were popular rhythm games on the console side. The PC side even saw their own little games that gained popularity like Osu, Muse Dash, Thumper, and Friday Night Funkin'. All of these games do have a little something in common with one another, however. Something that's a little more representative of rhythm games as a whole. The gameplay styles seem very rigid, for a lack of a better term. The games follow the gameplay style of game tells you when to hit the button, player hits the button. The game usually ties these button presses to the music to aid the player with the presses. For what it is, it works and helps give the right impression for games like Guitar Hero where it feels like you're playing an instrument, but I've always found it odd how most of rhythm games just come across as a glorified game of Simon Says. It doesn't worsen the gameplay of any of these games I listed before. In fact, I'm a huge fan of Rhythm Heaven and Friday Night Funkin', and I think it works well in those cases. It's just, when most of the time someone describes a rhythm game, they're usually referring to that game of Simon Says. However, in more recent times I've noticed a few games that somewhat break the mold of the predefined rhythm game. While it, in essence, keeps the rhythm aspect, it drastically changes the game to be far removed from that pre-baked formula. I know there are a good handful of games that break the mold, but for this video I wanted to highlight 3 in particular that I'm familiar with. And I'll start with them in order of release. So first up was actually my bigger introduction to this whole mess of rhythm games, Crypto the Necrodancer. Initially released on PC in 2015 by Brace Yourself Games, Crypto the Necrodancer is a rhythm roguelike. To quickly explain myself, a roguelike is a game that takes a lot of inspirations from 1980s Rogue, a top-down dungeon crawler where movement is turn-based, meaning that when the player moves, so do the monsters. Necrodancer follows a similar philosophy with its players and monsters. Movement is grid-based, and players are tasked with exploring the level and making it to the end. However, where Rogue's actions were tied to player movement, Necrodancer's actions are tied to rhythm. Rather than have the monsters move when the player moves, monsters will move to the beat of the music. The player is also forced to move to the beat of the music, and has to navigate and defeat enemies to proceed to the next stage before the song runs out. Though simple, it has a really effective gameplay style. Every monster type has a different method of movement on the beat, so it becomes a task of the players to remember and maneuver themselves around each enemy to avoid damage. Enemies like blue slimes will only move up and down every other beat. Skeletons will move towards the player every other beat, or when they raise their hands. And the list goes on, growing more complex as the levels get harder. Like goblins who only move towards the player when their back is turned, or blade masters who parry initial hits and counterattack. Players can also change the way they move around through use of various items found on different runs. Each weapon has a different method of attack that can change how they maneuver through each level of the crypt, and can also change how players deal with certain enemies. Certain enemies become difficult to deal with in using one weapon, but easier with others. Then, there's always the issue of fighting enemies in a group. You have to start learning how each individual enemy moves while fighting them in a group. You set to target enemies they're about to attack, deal a bit of damage to a tankier one and narrowly dodge another one. Maybe use an item or a spell to assist you, all while keeping the beat. Each track has a different tempo as well, which could lead to easy mistakes if you're not careful. Fittingly enough, it creates the sort of dance that you perform whenever you get into an encounter. It's as much a game of skill as it is strategy, all unified by music. Fast forwarding a couple years to 2022, Nippon Ichi Software releases Mad Rat Dead, a rhythm platformer game. I'll be honest, I was skeptical about this idea at first. Combining rhythm game mechanics and platforming seemed like a recipe for disaster. with how precise platforming can be and how restricting rhythm can be. But after giving the demo a shot, I was sold. The mechanics of Mad Rat Dead function similarly to Necrodancer, with actions having to be performed to the beat of the song rather than at the player's choice. Where it changes drastically is applying the mechanic to a 2D side-scroller rather than a top-down dungeon crawler. The player is still able to move independently from the music, albeit very slowly, so rhythm is incorporated into the moveset like a dash. Pressing the button on the beat causes the player to do a short dash in a direction. As players become more accustomed to the game's controls, this dash becomes the main method of movement, always being performed on beat. Of course, all the other actions are tied to the beat as well, like jumping and air dashing. The slow walk you do simply becomes a way to readjust without using the beat. That being said, levels are designed in a way where there won't be much need to adjust, as performing the right actions at the right time will let the player get to the end of the level with little to no error. They're designed like an obstacle course that challenges the player to think, what action should I do now, all the while keeping the beat to get a good grade at the end. The levels themselves can be a bit harsh at times though. Sometimes an obstacle will blindside those who aren't prepared, or actions that one would assume to be correct could cause the player to screw themselves over soon. Not to mention the game's respawn mechanic, rewinding the clock a few seconds, can cause the player to repeatedly die if they respawn in the wrong place. It's not a perfect rhythm game, but not bad for an attempt. It's got a lot of charm, and in my opinion, though that just needs to be said, the soundtrack is astounding. It makes dealing with the tough levels all the more bearable. And finally, shifting over to this year, or at least the year I recorded this in, Tango Gameworks hit us all with their surprise release of Hi-Fi Rush, a rhythm hack and slash and adventure game. From the moment of its reveal/launch, fans were raving about the game's style, but I never really saw much about how the game functioned. Again, I was weary. A game like Devil May Cry, where actions were locked to the beat, didn't seem like it would work. And here I am with nearly every achievement in the game. Like every other game on this list, Hi-Fi Rush's actions are tied to the beat of the song. Jumping, dashing, parrying, attacking, all of it. However, it takes cues from both Necrodancer and Mad Rat Dead's philosophies. Moving about normally is an action that's not restrained to the beat, allowing for easy readjustment in fights. And enemies are also bound to the beat, making it easier for players to retaliate against enemy attacks. The attacking combo system was also very well implemented. Most other games like this, Devil May Cry, Bayonetta, some of the third game, are heavily reliant on combos for their attacks, inputting the right buttons at the right time, at the right speed to let the attacks go off. The combos in Hi-Fi Rush act similarly, but it's emphasized to the player that timed button presses are more important than reacting to visuals. Rather than just mash the buttons hoping the combo goes off, as long as the player pushes the buttons in the right time and the right rhythm, the attack will go off. The game is even open to those with no sense of rhythm, with accessibility options like an on-screen rhythm indicator and a plethora of hints. Honestly, these hints provided a lot more help than I thought they would have. One of the bigger ones for me personally was to push the attack button when a hit lands in order to guarantee the timing for the next button press. It really eased the rhythm aspect for me. The way everything moves to the music really just nails the rhythm aspect. The attack combos being tied to the music rather than the traditional timing helps players get into the beat, especially with how the game provides sound effects whenever the attack buttons are pressed, with the crowd cheering and calling out the protagonist's name. Enemy attacks being tied to the rhythm also aids with this music aspect. Because you know that an attack will be on beat, the player doesn't have to rely on visual cues that much. If you know an attack is coming, you can just dodge or parry in time with the music. It's all very interesting to me, how something like a platformer or a hack and slash that seems really freeform can mesh so well with something like a rhythm game that usually comes across as rigid in its gameplay style. It creates this strange combination of a game that both flows well but has some level of rigidness. Yet this rigidness feels circumvented by the use of rhythm. I never had a moment playing any of these games where I felt restrained by the rhythm mechanics. The music gives it this flow that makes you forget that you're bound to a mechanic, one that you wouldn't have to deal with in a traditional version of that game. It makes the game stand out to me personally, especially since games like these usually have the driving force to their soundtracks as well. I always look forward to games that want to take a new genre into the rhythm department. I'm aware of a few other games like BPM, Bullets Per Minute, and Metal Hellsinger, which are rhythm first-person shooters, and I'm always on the prowl for new rhythm games. I'm hoping to see how different developers can take their rhythm genre further, and I'm especially looking forward to the soundtracks that games like these can provide.